Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 44 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. I produced these episodes with the intent for them to be accessible and digestible on their own. That means I want you to be able to listen to them and get something out of them, even if you haven't listened to all the previous episodes. That said, if you feel lost or you just want to understand the story in its full context, that context can usually be found in earlier episodes. Last time, I discussed the movements for independence in the Baltic states, Lithuania's 1990 Declaration of Independence, and the ensuing blockade crisis. Today, I will take a step back and begin a two-part introduction of a character who is about to take center stage in our story, Boris Yeltsin. This is The End of History, Part 44. One of my favorite movies is the 2008 Batman movie, The Dark Knight, starring Christian Bale as the Caped Crusader. I love the whole trilogy, to be honest, but The Dark Knight, the second movie in the trilogy, stands out for a number of reasons, especially the characters. Heath Ledger as the Joker is second to none, and in my opinion, it may have been his best performance. But today, I'm thinking of another character from that movie, Harvey Dent, played by Aaron Eckhart, Gotham's incorruptible district attorney who is eventually driven mad by the Joker, falling from his pedestal as a hero to become the villain, Two-Face. At one point early in the film, Dent, in a rhetorical debate over the merits of the Batman, proclaims, quote, "You either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain," end quote. As I prepared for today's episode, I kept thinking of this line, how someone at one point can be almost universally beloved, and only a few years later become one of the world's most hated individuals. That is the case for the subject of today's episode, Boris Yeltsin, who perhaps was never quite seen as a villain, more of a national embarrassment, but nonetheless has become a hated and reviled figure in modern Russia. At one time, however, he was overwhelmingly popular. He was seen as the founder and leader of a new, free, and democratic Russia. On June 12, 1991, he received about 58% of the vote in the election for the presidency of what was then the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic in a four-way race, beating the closest runner-up by over 40 points. When he stood for re-election as the president of the post-Soviet Russian Federation in 1996, he won a closer but still decisive victory, beating his challenger from the Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, by 14 points, with a total of 54% of the vote. When he resigned the presidency of Russia on New Year's Eve 1999, however, his approval rating, according to most polls, was in the single digits. A 2018 poll from the Russian Levada Center found that just 15% of Russians had a positive view of Yeltsin, coming in behind even Gorbachev, who had a 17% favorability rating, though Gorbachev had a significantly higher negativity rating, with over 60% of respondents saying they had a negative view of Gorbachev, and only around 55% expressing similarly negative views of Yeltsin. However you slice it, though, most Russians today don't like Yeltsin. I said all the way back in the first episode of this series that although I was alive for some of the events I'm covering in this series, I don't remember most of them. Having been born in 1989, I wasn't really tuned into geopolitics in the late 80s and early 90s. But I do remember Boris Yeltsin, and as a kid, I distinctly remember having a peculiar fascination with the new Russia and its president. Now, I'm talking about being 6, 7, 8 years old, so I didn't have a complex understanding of the politics or the history, but I was aware enough of current and recent events to understand that Russia had recently been the Soviet Union and that it was now a democracy. And Yeltsin, to me, and to many others inside and outside Russia, was the symbol of that democracy. Yeltsin was a friend of the United States, and his close personal friendship with US President Bill Clinton was a symbol of the new era of cooperation and friendship between two former adversaries, with the US, of course, now in the senior position of the partnership. At the time, of course, I saw all this through the lens of post Cold War triumphalism that just permeated American society in the 90s. There was a naivety and an arrogance to this way of thinking and looking at the world that I can forgive myself for because, as I said, I was a child. What I did not understand and wouldn't have been able to comprehend at the time was that while most Russians in the 90s also associated Yeltsin with Russia's budding democracy, many of them did not see that as a good thing. What you have to understand about Russia in the 90s is that it was a time of economic collapse and what many saw as societal decay. Inflation skyrocketed, pensions became worthless, wages stagnated and did not keep up with the rapid inflation, and average people generally struggled and suffered. Meanwhile, the policies of privatization spearheaded by Yeltsin and his government meant to plunge Russia into the deep end of capitalism and spur economic growth, in reality resulted in a selling off of the formerly state-owned means of production to a new class of oligarchs. This oligarch class was made up of the people who had the liquidity to be able to purchase major assets for cash while the economy shrank and markets plummeted. In practice, this was generally a mix of corrupt former Communist Party insiders and outright criminals, with the line between the two often blurred. Yeltsin, though he had many virtues, and I will talk about them, was also notoriously corrupt. And there's a ton of evidence that he or members of his family benefited personally from some of those transactions. So to average Russians, there was a perception, I think a correct one, that their country was being sold to the highest bidder by a corrupt president while they were allowed to suffer and their savings and pensions became worthless. And this was the system with which Russians came to associate the word democracy. And so, not surprisingly, democracy took on a negative connotation in many circles. Russians who lived through this time invented a word to describe it, which is as clever as it is vulgar. It combines the Russian word for democracy, demokratia, with the Russian word for shit, dirmo, and it became dirmokratia. As I'm sure you can guess, it generally translates as democracy is shit. The Russian language can be fun that way sometimes. Aside from the failure of his domestic policies, Yeltsin also came to be seen as an embarrassment on the international stage. Boris Yeltsin was an alcoholic, and though that hardly makes him unique among Russian men, as Russia consistently leads the globe in deaths directly attributable to alcoholism, especially among men, his inability to keep his drinking problem discreet was a source of national embarrassment. The most notorious example was during his first official state visit to the United States in 1994. Yeltsin was encountered by Secret Service agents outside Blair House in Washington, D.C., where he was staying at the time. The Russian president was visibly drunk, in his underwear, attempting to hail a taxi and refusing to cooperate with the baffled agents because he was determined to get a pizza. When asked about it years later, Bill Clinton, with his trademark charm, simply remarked, "Well, he got his pizza." I'll say two things in Yeltsin's defense here. First, I think we've all been there. Second, having lived in Russia, I can attest there's a lot of wonderful food available there. But they haven't mastered the art of pizza. It's one thing Americans are just better at, so can you really blame him for wanting to get a slice while he was here? While that incident was successfully kept out of the press at the time, only being revealed by an investigative reporter years later in 2009, the problem was that there were plenty of incidents related to Yeltsin's drinking that were very public. When Yeltsin again met President Clinton the following year in Hyde Park, New York, the Washington Post reported that he was visibly inebriated at the joint press conference. And there are just too many videos of him stumbling, slurring his speech, and exhibiting other stereotypically drunk behavior for there to be any debate over the fact that he was pretty constantly drunk while performing his presidential duties. And yet, Yeltsin was not always hated or seen as an embarrassment. There was a time when he was the very symbol of Russian strength. He was the man who stood atop a tank in open defiance of the coup leaders in August 1991, who bravely stood against the hardliners in defense of Russians' newly found political freedom. He was the strong leader who led Russia out of the collapse of the USSR in its emergence as a new and proud nation. A strong leader, a democratic idealist, a drunk, and a crook. Boris Yeltsin was all of these things and more. He was an immensely complex figure. He was also one of the most pivotal figures in recent world history. He was pivotal not only because he led the anti-communist revolution in Russia and became post-Soviet Russia's first president, but also because when he resigned the presidency of that new nation in 1999, he handed power to an obscure politician from St. Petersburg, who was not a household name at the time, a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin. Without Yeltsin, the Soviet Union does not dissolve in the way it did, and modern Russia looks very different than it does. So let's talk about Yeltsin. Where did he come from? What were his motivations? And how did he emerge as a leader equipped to influence our story as dramatically as he did? Yeltsin's origins at first glance are rather similar to Gorbachev's. Yeltsin was born on February 1st, 1931, just a month and a day before his future ally turned rival, Gorbachev. And he was born in the village of Butka in Russia's Ural Oblast, about 235 kilometers from the nearest major city, Yekaterinburg, or Sverdlovsk in Soviet times. His paternal grandfather, Ignatiy, was a prominent figure in the region, who prior to the revolution built a particularly prosperous farm. Even after the revolution, the Yeltsins at first continued to thrive under Lenin's new economic policy. The agricultural reforms of Stalin put a stop to that in the years just before Boris's birth. Ignatiy Yeltsin was branded a kulak and stripped of his wealth and property. In 1934, when Boris was only 3, his grandfather was deported to a mining colony in Nadezhdinsk, a place whose name ironically translates roughly as place of hope. He died there 2 years later. That same year, Boris and his family moved to Kazan, where he began attending school. There, his father, Nikolai, was also caught up in Stalin's purge. He was arrested for anti-Soviet agitation and sentenced to 3 years in the Gulag. Nikolai Yeltsin was among those that survived, returning to his family 3 years later in 1937. Much of Boris's childhood was spent moving around various towns and cities in the Urals, following the meager opportunities available to those branded enemies of the people under Stalin. You may recall from my introductory episodes on Gorbachev that both his grandfathers were also caught up in Stalin's purges, and that his family also suffered under Stalin. The main difference in the childhood experience between these two men is that one of Gorbachev's grandfathers, his maternal grandfather Panteley Gopkala, though he had been arrested and imprisoned by Stalin, was an avowed communist and true believer in the Soviet socialist project. Even after his imprisonment, he was convinced that the injustice he had suffered was due to the corruption of local officials, and that Stalin must have had nothing to do with it. He passed this true belief in communism on to his grandson, who, though his views eventually evolved and he would come to denounce Stalin for what had happened to his family and millions like them, Gorbachev remained a true believer in the cause of socialism. Yeltsin had no such influence in his life. We don't know much about Boris Yeltsin's political outlook as a young man, I think largely because, as the child and grandchild of enemies of the people, he was careful to remain as apolitical as possible. He avoided politics as much as possible, eschewing all optional party activities and only participating in those komsomol meetings and ideology classes which were compulsory for all students. He did the bare minimum and strived to fly under the radar. Few would have predicted that this was a young man who would grow up to be a party boss and political leader. Rather than politics, Yeltsin preferred to focus on sports, an area in which he excelled. I have to admit that when I first read that and saw photos of the young, fit, athletic Boris Yeltsin, I did a bit of a double take. I remember Yeltsin from the years of his presidency as an overweight old man with a spotty red face, likely from his alcoholism. But it's true. As a young man, Boris Yeltsin was a star athlete. He played all kinds of sports competitively. Particularly, he excelled at volleyball. He became the captain of his school team, and it was through this that he was first given the opportunity to travel outside the Ural region and see the wider Soviet Union, traveling as far as Latvia and Georgia to compete. It was on the volleyball court that Yeltsin showed the first signs of his leadership prowess. Despite flying under the radar politically and therefore taking on no leadership roles in student organizations, he was a natural leader on the court, the person his teammates looked to. He offered encouragement and constructive criticism, and unlike so many petty tyrants who call themselves leaders, his teammates all recall that he could accept criticism as well as he could dish it out, taking it constructively and using it to improve his play. In addition to his success on the volleyball court, Yeltsin displayed a natural intelligence that also led him to excel academically, earning top marks in his classes. At the same time, however, he displayed a youthful, rebellious streak that was as destructive as it was relatable. In his 1990 autobiography, Yeltsin recalled the story of how he came to lose 2 fingers on one of his hands. He and his friends decided to break into a local military warehouse and steal some grenades. After the successful heist, Yeltsin, ever curious, decided to take one of the grenades apart to try and understand how it worked. Needless to say, the grenade went off, and Yeltsin lost his left thumb and index finger. In 1949, Yeltsin was admitted to the Ural Polytechnic Institute, or UPI, in Sverdlovsk, now once again named Yekaterinburg, where he studied industrial and civil engineering. As I've mentioned before on this podcast, in the Soviet Union, engineering was among the most prestigious professions, and engineering programs usually attracted some of the best students, Yeltsin being no exception. At UPI, he continued to play volleyball, traveling the country with his team, and he also excelled academically. He also continued to avoid all but compulsory political involvement. When he was forced to study Marxism-Leninism, he excelled and earned top marks in the subject, but did not join any of the optional Communist Party organizations or clubs as extracurricular activities, still preferring to focus his free time on sports and fitness. While at UPI, he also met, courted, and married his classmate, Naina Girina. He finished his studies in 1955 before going to work in the state-run construction industry, first as a trainee, then a foreman. From very early on in his career, Yeltsin proved himself to be different from many of the other construction foremen in this state-run Soviet industry. He gained a reputation for dedication to his work, and the crews under his supervision often completed projects under budget and ahead of schedule. He was also seen as a leader by the construction workers he supervised. Unlike many foremen, he was always on the site with his workers, sharing in their hardships, and getting his hands dirty doing the same hard labor they were doing. He led by example and motivated his workers through positive reinforcement. As he had on the volleyball court, he also gained a reputation for taking criticism well, when confronted directly with it. But he also gained a reputation for vengefulness when he found out someone went behind his back to complain about him or undermine him, something that was all too common in the Soviet system. By January 1960, Yeltsin had risen to become the head engineer of Directorate 13 of the Sverdlovsk region, as high as anybody in the Soviet construction industry could hope to rise without becoming a party member. Yeltsin's hard work and leadership skills did not go unnoticed by the local Communist Party officials, and rather than Yeltsin seeking to join the party actually sought him out and recruited him to join, something that was rare as Communist Party membership was the main key to advancement in the Soviet system, and spots were very competitive. But the regional apparatchiks understood that Yeltsin was well respected by his peers and subordinates, and they hoped to add his reputation to theirs, while also offering him career advancement that would have been unavailable to him as a non-party member. In March 1960, likely for practical reasons of career advancement rather than any ideological commitment, Boris Yeltsin joined the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as a probationary member. A year later, he became a full party member, a full decade after Gorbachev attained that same status. At first, it seemed Yeltsin was content to use the connections he gained from his party membership to advance his career, and had no intention of embarking on a career in politics. He did not have the makings of a traditional politician in the Soviet system. Communist Party politics in the Soviet Union were built around speaking in platitudes, talking around difficult subjects, and never saying what one really meant, but rather speaking in a sort of code that was meant to be read between the lines. Yeltsin was not like that. He was straightforward and blunt, some would even say bullish. His success in the construction trade had been built on his ability to cut through BS and get to the point. He spoke like a regular person. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said. He was intelligent, but he talked like an ordinary person, refusing to adopt the pseudo-academic language common to party apparatchiks. In short, Yeltsin was a sort of populist built for the politics of a democracy, but seemed an ill fit for the intrigues of Soviet intra-party politics. He hardly seemed like a man destined for a career in the upper echelon of the Communist Party. Yet, in the mid-1960s, beginning in 1963, while continuing to advance his career in the construction trade, he stood for election to his local and regional Soviets as the unopposed candidate put forward by the Communist Party. These local Soviets were not permanent bodies, but temporary committees whose job it was to elect delegates to the Republic and Union level Soviets, who in turn would elect the members of the Presidium as well as the Premier or Prime Minister. I explained all this back in the very first episode of the series for anyone who wants a refresher. In other words, this was something Yeltsin could do part-time to fulfill his obligations as a party member, while still being able to focus on the various construction projects he was managing across the region. Yeltsin's service in the Soviets allowed him to cut his teeth on navigating the USSR's complex political system, and he actually proved remarkably adaptable, even learning to speak the language of the party bureaucrats, even if he was never able to do so very convincingly. He did it well enough to be noticed by some of the Sverdlovsk region's senior party leaders, including Yakov Rabov, the regional party first secretary. In 1968, Rabov was determined to bring Yeltsin into the party's inner circle. He was frustrated with the slow pace of various construction projects around the region, and decided to replace the ineffective bureaucrat at the top of the regional party's construction department. When he put Yeltsin's name forward as a potential replacement, several members of the party's Central Committee objected, noting Yeltsin's tardiness in acquiring party membership and questioning the sincerity of his commitment to the party. But Rabov made his case, and won the vote approving Yeltsin's appointment to a full-time position overseeing the construction industry for the regional party. On Yeltsin's end, there isn't really a clear picture of what drove him to accept the appointment, having never been enthusiastic about politics. He wrote in his memoirs simply that he, quote, felt like taking a new step, end quote. Rabov, for his part, who was barely mentioned in Yeltsin's memoir, recalled, quote, he was not dying to have this job, but after our chat, he gave his agreement, end quote. Very likely it was naked ambition that prompted him to accept the position, combined perhaps with threats to the stability of his existing career should he insult the party by refusing the appointment. Yeltsin would later say of his decision, quote, I became not merely a boss, but a man of power. I threw myself into a party career as I had once thrown myself into hitting a volleyball, end quote. Under Yeltsin, the construction industry in Sverdlovsk was moderately successful during a time when much of the Soviet economy was stagnating, and whether or not he was actually responsible for this success, Yeltsin was happy to claim the credit. One of the traits that almost immediately showed itself upon Yeltsin's embrace of a political career was a natural talent for self-promotion and publicity. He launched highly publicized lightning construction campaigns, organized mass events where construction workers from across the region would come together to construct a new factory or housing block in a matter of days. While the quality of some of these projects was questionable, they made Yeltsin highly popular. He always made sure that when the cameras filmed these projects, he was front and center with a shovel and a hard hat, leading the way. This media savvy would be the hallmark of his later political career. Despite the high-profile nature of his position, Yeltsin did not appear to be on the fast track to advancement in the party. Ultimately, it was luck more than anything else that opened the way for his meteoric rise. In 1975, Eduard Shevardnadze, who was then the first secretary of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic Party, hired away the Sverdlovsk region's party second secretary, Gennady Kolbin, to serve as his subordinate in Georgia. Despite his earlier advocacy for Yeltsin, Rabin did not initially look to him as a potential replacement, looking instead to more senior members of the Regional Central Committee. He went first to Vyacheslav Bayev, the head of Sverdlovsk machine building department, but Bayev was not ambitious and refused the appointment. Rabin then approached the regional secretary for industry, Yevgeny Korovin, and offered him the position. Korovin was sickly and getting on in years. He was frank with Rabin, telling him that he did not believe that in his ill health he would be able to handle the added responsibilities of being the regional second secretary. He recommended Yeltsin. Rabin still believed Yeltsin too inexperienced, but relented that if Korovin would agree to the appointment, he would agree to promote Yeltsin and make him Korovin's subordinate, so that the responsibilities could be shared. Yeltsin biographer Timothy Colton speculates that Yeltsin likely bristled at being given the responsibility without the commensurate title, but nonetheless accepted the appointment, as it was a clear sign that he was being groomed for leadership. By the following year, in October 1976, Rabin seems to have come around on his view of Yeltsin's readiness for leadership. At that time, Rabin was promoted to the Central Committee in Moscow, and rather than promote the actual second secretary to fill his shoes, Rabin recommended the man who had been doing the actual work of the second secretary for the last year, Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin. He convinced the Regional Central Committee to go along with his wish and elect Yeltsin to the position. Yeltsin's election was personally approved by Leonid Brezhnev, and in November 1976, Boris Yeltsin became the regional party boss for the entire Sverdlovsk region. In 1976, Sverdlovsk was geographically one of the largest regions in the USSR, eclipsing 8 of the 15 republics in size. It was also the fourth most populous oblast in the Russian Soviet Republic. Yet, while it was large and populous, to the elite party leadership in Moscow, Sverdlovsk seemed a remote backwater, barely worthy of their attention. So as long as the oblast's economic output met the metric of the 5-year plans and there were no great disturbances, Yeltsin had a great deal of autonomy to run the region how he pleased. He approached executive leadership much as he had approached leadership of construction crews as a younger man. He was straightforward and results-oriented. Apparatchiks who failed to meet his expectations were demoted or reassigned, and they were replaced with men who were promoted on merit. He could be a harsh taskmaster, often pushing his subordinates to work harder and meet higher expectations, but he was also open to advice and even criticism when he was approached directly and respectfully. Throughout the late Brezhnev years and the years of the interregnum under the leadership of Andropov and Chernenko, Yeltsin held the party line, echoing official ideology and even engaging publicly in the cult of personality around Brezhnev, though he personally found it pathetic. He did, however, push at the edges of acceptable behavior from a party-first secretary, even daring to advocate for market-based economic reforms. He later recalled that he did not yet have an ideological awakening at this time, still accepting for the most part the system as he had always known it. But he could see as well as anybody that as the country sank into economic stagnation and eventually decline, certain aspects of that system were not working, and he was not afraid to say so. Though his calls for reform were certainly expressed carefully, he did not shy away from expressing them. For example, in 1979, he refused calls to lower the price of meat in supermarkets, instead instituting a program that would directly link prices to the market forces of supply and demand. He coupled this with programs to increase productivity of the farms in his region and tireless efforts to secure more food supplies for his region from other parts of the USSR as well as from abroad. Ultimately, this program added to his region's fiscal solvency while increasing agricultural productivity and stabilizing the price of food. He got away with it mostly because it worked. The central planners in Moscow were much more concerned with results than methods, even if those methods conflicted with the state's official ideology. Yeltsin also did not enthusiastically prosecute purely political crimes. He held the party line to the extent necessary to avoid raising the concern of the local KGB, but was never particularly zealous in going after political dissidents. He later confessed that during his time as first secretary in Sverdlovsk, he was actually frequently reading samizdat journals published by underground dissident groups. That was not actually all that uncommon among high-ranking party members. Yuri Andropov was known to read samizdat publications and regularly listened to banned music while he was head of the KGB. During these years, Yeltsin managed to thread the needle of walking the party line closely enough to avoid suspicion, while also gaining a reputation as an ambitious reformer. All of this set him up perfectly in 1985 to become a key part of Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika. Mikhail Gorbachev had limited interactions with Yeltsin in the past, none of which left him positively disposed to the Sverdlovsk first secretary. The two had battled over Yeltsin's food initiative when Gorbachev was the Central Committee's minister in charge of agriculture from 1978 to 1985. Gorbachev, himself a strong advocate of reform, took little issue with the substance of Yeltsin's program, but felt that Yeltsin was disrespectful and lacked the tact and temperament for higher leadership. There were others in Gorbachev's inner circle, however, who had a much more positive opinion of Yeltsin. Above all, Yegor Ligachev. Longtime listeners will recall from my episodes on Yuri Andropov and Mikhail Gorbachev's rise that Gorbachev's path to advancement was paved by Andropov's patronage. Andropov, though the hardest of hardliners when it came to the authoritarian nature of government, was more conscious than his predecessors of how the Soviet system was failing and of the need for reform. And Gorbachev was not the only young party member he selected for preferment and advancement. In 1983, he had instructed Ligachev to travel to Sverdlovsk and have a look at the local party boss. Though Andropov would die before the vetting was complete and Yeltsin could actually be promoted, Ligachev was highly impressed with Yeltsin. He later recalled of his first meeting with Yeltsin, quote, "The liveliness of Yeltsin's relations with people, his vigor, and his decisiveness appealed to me. It was obvious that many had heartfelt respect for him." End quote. When Gorbachev stepped into power in March 1985, he enlisted Ligachev in his search for younger, reform-minded party leaders to help him implement his program. People who would displace the gerontocracy of the Brezhnev era and help make perestroika a reality. Yeltsin was at the top of Ligachev's list. He told Gorbachev, quote, "This is our kind of person. We have to pick him." End quote. And so it was that in April 1985, the new General Secretary summoned Boris Yeltsin to Moscow to offer him a leading role in his unprecedented program of reform. Though he would at first play hard to get and feign disinterest in the promotion, in truth, the ambitious Yeltsin never looked back. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, a very special thank you to my patrons who support the show with monthly donations on Patreon. If you appreciate what I do and want to support the show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/historyspherepodcast. If you can't afford to become a patron, I get it. Times are hard right now. You can also support the show by giving it a 5-star rating on your podcast platform of choice, subscribing, and by telling your friends about us. If you're listening on Spotify, you can leave a comment directly on the episode, and I encourage you to do that. Ask a question, correct a mistake, or just tell me what you thought of the episode. More engagement helps to promote the show in the algorithm and introduce it to new listeners, so all of your input is greatly appreciated. Links to the Patreon, the show's social media pages, and all my streaming platforms can be found on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find a list of my sources for this episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. Next time on The History Sphere, I will continue my discussion of Boris Yeltsin as he enters national politics and ultimately clashes with Mikhail Gorbachev and the Communist Party. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.